we hide, project, and sabotage ourselves. There is a strange quietness in the spaces between who we are and who we present ourselves to be. A silence that becomes deafening the longer it is ignored. In every handshake, every smile, every word carefully chosen to avoid rejection, there lies a subtle performance, an invisible mask. And this mask, which Jung calls the persona, is not simply a harmless social tool. It is both bridge and barrier, a gateway to connection, and a fortress of self-deception. The persona is the face we wear in the theater of society. It is the version of ourselves we curate, polished, agreeable, competent, admired. But the danger begins when this mask is no longer something we wear consciously, but something we begin to believe is us. Think of the doctor who must always appear certain, even when in doubt. The mother who must smile endlessly, even while she quietly breaks. The spiritual teacher who speaks of peace, yet has not made peace with his own rage. They are not lying, but they are slowly forgetting. The persona is necessary without it. Civilization would dissolve into chaos. It is a psychological adaptation, just as clothing is a physical one. We cannot show our entire self in every moment. But when we identify with the persona entirely, when we mistake the mask for the soul, we lose access to something far more essential: our authentic self. This fragmentation does not occur loudly. It occurs quietly. Like water dripping through limestone, it carves itself into the psyche. Over time, the self becomes brittle, unfulfilled, confused. People describe a sense of emptiness they cannot name. They say, "I have everything I should want, so why do I feel so lost?" They feel lost not because they lack purpose, but because they are playing a role that has outlived its script, and the persona, once created to protect, now begins to imprison. It becomes the beautiful lie that separates them from their own truth. Psychologically, this dissonance is exhausting. Neuroscience tells us that cognitive dissonance, the gap between belief and behavior, activates regions of stress in the brain, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex. This is not merely a spiritual crisis, it is a biological one. Living out of alignment with our truth floods the nervous system with chronic tension. The body begins to protest what the mind refuses to admit. Herein lies the crucial insight. The more energy we invest in maintaining the persona, the less vitality is available for genuine growth. We become like an actor who never leaves the stage. Applause becomes our drug. Criticism, a mortal wound. Intimacy feels threatening. Vulnerability feels dangerous. This is not weakness. This is the psyche defending itself, and so many of us become well-adjusted masks. We say the right things. We play the right roles. But deep down, we sense an ache, a yearning for something more raw, more real, more whole. But to remove the mask feels terrifying, because beneath it lies not just truth, but often shame. Beneath the smile may lie the wound. Beneath the charm may lie loneliness. Beneath the competence may lie the fear of being inadequate. And so we cling to the persona. We refine it. We enhance it. We brand it. We post it. We wrap our identity around it like a second skin. But the more we do this, the further we drift from the inner compass of the soul, the self, which Jung calls the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious. This is not a condemnation. It is a recognition. Every human being wears a mask. Every culture creates an ideal. Every child learns what will be praised and what will be punished. The persona is not the enemy. It is simply incomplete. It is not evil. It is just insufficient. To live only through the persona is to live in exile, not from others, but from oneself. True healing begins with awareness, with pausing long enough to ask, whose life am I living? Whose voice am I trying to impress? What have I hidden from others and from myself? These are not easy questions. They are not comfortable, but they are essential. Because only when we begin to dismantle the false self can the true self begin to emerge. And in that emergence, a different kind of strength arises, not the strength of perfection, but the strength of authenticity. Not the armor of image, but the courage to be seen flawed, unfinished, human. Because the paradox is this: when we stop performing, we begin to transform. The persona does not arrive fully formed. It is sculpted quietly, gradually in the early theater of childhood, in the soft crucible of parental gaze, societal norms, and peer judgment. The child begins to understand, often without words, that some parts of them are welcome and others are not. This shaping is not always abusive. In fact, it often happens in the name of love. When a child cries and is told to be strong, they learn that sadness must be hidden. When they are too loud and told to be good, they understand that expression must be softened. When they are too excited, too angry, too curious, too intense, and those qualities are met with withdrawal, ridicule, or punishment, they do not stop feeling these things. They simply learn to bury them. The psyche is astonishingly adaptive. To be accepted is to survive. And survival always wins. The child, intuitive, sensitive, alert, begins to disown pieces of themselves in exchange for belonging. They tuck away the wildness, the rage, the sorrow, the desire, the weirdness, and offer in return a version of self that feels more safe, more lovable, more predictable. This is the origin of the mask. It is here, long before we are conscious of it, that the persona begins to form, not as a conscious choice, but as an unconscious pact. I will show you who you want me to be, so that you will not abandon me. We must understand, this is not weakness, it is intelligence. The child does not have the language to speak of shame, or repression, or psychological fragmentation. But the body remembers, the nervous system remembers, and the persona becomes the armor against that memory. As we grow, the mask becomes more intricate. It adapts to school, to religion, to culture. The artist may hide in the mathematician. The philosopher may disguise themselves as the athlete. The sensitive soul may grow into the sarcastic cynic. Each adaptation is a strategy. Keep what's vulnerable hidden. Project what's rewarded. But the pain of this is subtle. It does not cry out immediately. It waits. It waits in the quiet spaces, in the hesitation before speaking your truth, in the awkwardness of being praised for something you don't actually value, in the quiet ache of not recognizing yourself in the mirror of other people's expectations. This internal dissonance can, over time, turn into anxiety, depression, addiction, fatigue, not because something is wrong with the person, but because something essential has been left behind. Modern psychology affirms this. Studies in affective neuroscience show that suppressing emotions, especially in early developmental stages, leads to heightened amygdala activity, lowered vagal tone, and long-term stress dysregulation. In layman's terms, pretending to be someone else, day after day, wears down the mind, the body, and the spirit. And so, many adults find themselves haunted by a question they cannot articulate. What did I trade in exchange for being accepted? This is not about blaming parents, society, or culture. It is about seeing clearly. Every human being has been conditioned. Every family system teaches lessons spoken and unspoken about what is safe to express. And often, those who raised us were themselves wearing masks they never removed. Trauma replicates. Silence echoes. The deeper tragedy is that, over time, we may not only hide these unacceptable parts, we may forget they ever existed. The original self, vibrant, instinctual, honest, becomes a distant whisper. And when it tries to speak, the persona reacts like an immune system, treating the self as an intruder. This is why reclaiming authenticity is not just a journey of expression. It is an act of remembering. To return to the self is to return to the parts we once locked away, to bring them into the light, not to be overwhelmed by them, but to learn from them, to hold them with dignity. Here, Jung's idea of the shadow re-enters the conversation. The persona and the shadow are twins born of the same split. What is placed into the persona is what is socially acceptable. What is cast into the shadow is what is socially condemned. The greater the perfection of the persona, the darker the shadow becomes. Thus, the smiling preacher who condemns sin but hides addiction. The teacher who demands discipline but rages in private. The loving parent who sacrifices everything and secretly resents it. These are not rare exceptions. They are everyday phenomena. We are all divided, and until we bring awareness to that division, the persona will tighten its grip and the shadow will act out in secret. This does not mean we must discard the persona. That would be naive and even dangerous. To live without a mask entirely is to live without boundaries, without discernment, without social intelligence. The goal is not to remove the mask. It is to wear it consciously, to know that it is a tool, not an identity, a role, not a soul. To do this, we must return to the root, to the childhood moment where the self was first split, to ask, what did I stop expressing to feel safe? Whose love did I fear losing? What parts of me remain frozen in time, still waiting for permission to be seen? These are not therapeutic questions alone. They are spiritual. Because behind every mask lies a sacred longing to be whole, to be known not just for our achievements or appearances, but for our essence raw, flawed, true. And that essence, once buried, does not die. It waits. It waits for us to return. We live in an era where image is everything, and the persona is no longer just worn in the quiet corners of our private lives. It is broadcasted, curated, tracked, liked. We are not merely living through masks now, we are performing them. In earlier generations, the persona was confined to roles within family, community, or career. Today, it spills into every digital interaction. On social media, each photograph, status, and reaction becomes a pixel in the collage of the idealized self. Every platform is a stage. Every post is a script. But the audience is no longer just society. It is now an algorithm. We shape ourselves not for authenticity, but for approval, not for connection, but for consumption. We are no longer only managing how others perceive us, we are now managing metrics. This is not harmless. In psychological terms, the constant reinforcement of an idealized identity leads to self-alienation, a fragmentation between the experienced self and the projected self. Clinical psychologists now speak of digital self, discrepancy, the emotional toll that arises when the online persona diverges too far from one's lived emotional reality. Imagine this: a person going through heartbreak, but posting smiling vacation photos to keep up appearances, or a man struggling with depression, yet maintaining an image of relentless success. Each moment of performance becomes a micro-betrayal, not to others, but to the self, and the psyche, like a sensitive instrument, registers every note out of tune. Neuroscience supports this. Chronic self discrepancy has been linked with increased cortisol levels, the stress hormone, disruptions in dopamine, signaling the reward system, and long-term impacts on memory and self. Image consolidation. In simpler terms, performing too long exhausts the brain, dulls pleasure, and erodes identity. But why do we do it? Because we are afraid. Because we have been taught that to be desirable, we must be flawless, that to be worthy, we must be impressive. The modern cult of hyper-individualism tells us that we are brands, that we must monetize the self, maximize attention, and optimize our image. And yet, something within us resists. Deep down, there is a fatigue that no amount of validation can erase. A quiet knowing that says, "This isn't me." That somewhere behind the likes, the filters, the accolades, a truer self waits, silently, patiently, and sometimes it cries out through burnout, panic attacks, or inexplicable sadness. All this, Jung would say, is the soul calling us home, because what we are witnessing, culturally, is not just a psychological crisis. It is a spiritual drought. We are starving, not for connection to others, but for connection to ourselves. And what is the cost? Relationships become transactional. Vulnerability becomes performance. Even healing becomes content. We show our wounds not to process them, but to receive applause for our growth. We say authenticity, but mean palatable honesty, the kind that is still flattering, the kind that won't risk too much. But the soul is not interested in performance. It is interested in truth. Jung understood that behind the persona lies a deeper call, the path of individuation, a path that demands we peel back the layers we have accumulated, that we face not only what we have shown the world, but what we have hidden from ourselves. This is why so many spiritual traditions speak of ego death not in dramatic, esoteric terms, but as a necessary shedding. The shedding of false identity, false power, false security. And while the world tells us that more is better, the inner journey often begins with less noise, less pretending, less striving. But make no mistake, this shedding is painful. It may feel like losing control, like losing reputation, like becoming invisible. But what is truly being lost is the illusion of control, the burden of reputation, and the mask of visibility. To no longer be defined by the persona is to walk into unknown territory, to say, I will no longer trade my soul for applause. I will no longer betray my truth for belonging. And in that moment, fragile, terrifying, sacred, we begin to find something we did not know we were missing. Peace. Not the peace that comes from others agreeing with us, but the peace that arises from inner alignment when the voice we hear inside matches the voice we speak outside, when the values we hold privately guide our public choices, when we no longer need to manage our image because our truth speaks for itself. This is not about becoming authentic as a trend. It is about becoming whole. And wholeness includes contradictions. It includes imperfection. It includes shadow. But it also includes freedom. Because when we stop feeding the mask, something extraordinary happens. We begin to see others more clearly. We no longer need them to validate us. We no longer project our unresolved pain onto them. We begin to listen, to empathize, to connect. This is where healing moves from the personal to the collective. Because when one person removes their mask, they invite others to do the same. Vulnerability becomes contagious. Honesty becomes magnetic. And a different kind of culture begins to emerge, not built on image, but on integrity. But for that to happen, we must first confront our own internalized scripts, the voices that say, "You're only valuable when," or "You must always appear." These voices do not come from the soul. They come from conditioning, and they can be written through deep introspection, therapy, spiritual practice, or honest conversation. We begin to recover the forgotten self. We begin to see not just who we pretend to be, but who we were before we were told who to be. And that self, bruised, buried, brilliant, is still waiting. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. The persona is the mask we show the world, polished, composed, acceptable. But what happens to the parts of ourselves we hide to maintain that illusion? Where do they go? They do not disappear. They descend. They descend into the unconscious, into the place Jung called the shadow. This is the unseen consequence of over-identification with the persona, the equal and opposite reaction of repression. Every trait we deny, every impulse we disown, every truth we silence becomes material for the shadow. The more light we shine on the mask, the darker the shadow grows behind it. And that shadow does not stay quiet. It waits not like a demon lurking in the corner, but more like an orphaned child, crying out in silence. If heard and embraced, it becomes a guide. If ignored, it becomes a saboteur. The trouble is, most of us don't see it coming. We imagine the shadow to be something monstrous, but it often slips through the cracks of everyday life. A sudden outburst during a calm discussion, a jealous thought toward a friend's success, a quiet pleasure in someone else's failure. These are not accidents. They are echoes, signals from a part of us we have denied for too long. Jung emphasized that what we repress does not become harmless, it becomes autonomous. The more we disown our anger, the more it erupts inappropriately. The more we suppress our desire, the more it leaks through fantasies and compulsions. The more we pretend to be good, the more the shadow insists on acting bad. This explains why people so often act against their own intentions, why the perfectionist sabotages their own success, why the pacifist lashes out when under pressure, why the spiritual teacher preaches compassion but abuses power. These contradictions are not moral failures. They are symptoms of fragmentation. The ego is not whole. The self is not integrated. And the shadow, unrecognized, takes the reins psychologically. This is known as projection. We see in others what we refuse to see in ourselves. A person who denies their own selfishness may accuse others of being greedy. One who represses their sexual desires may condemn others' sensuality. The judgment is not insight, it is displacement. And these projections are not limited to individuals. They shape entire cultures. A society that worships productivity but shames vulnerability will project its shadow onto the lazy, the weak, the emotional. It will marginalize the very traits it fears to admit are human. It will build institutions that reward masks and punish honesty. over time. This collective denial creates cultural pathology. Think of historical witch hunts, political scapegoating, and genocides. These are not merely political acts. They are psychological eruptions, collective shadows unleashed when the truth becomes unbearable. The evil we cannot face in ourselves must be cast outward, onto others. And so, the work of integrating the shadow is not just personal, it is ethical. When we take responsibility for our inner divisions, we reduce the need to blame others for our discomfort. We stop projecting and start reflecting. We begin to notice. That which irritates me in others may be a mirror of myself. This is a radical act because it dismantles the ego's favorite defense, righteousness. The ego wants to be the hero. The mask wants to be admired, but the soul wants to be real. And realness includes contradiction, complexity, paradox. It includes light and dark, strength and shame, wisdom and wounding. To embrace the shadow is to reclaim what we have lost, not just the pain, but the power. Because the shadow is not merely negative. Jung was clear. It also contains untapped gifts, creativity, instinct, intuition, assertiveness, all lie hidden beneath the persona's facade. When we integrate these qualities, we gain access to a richer, more spontaneous self. Consider this. A person taught that anger is dangerous may grow up timid, accommodating, unable to set boundaries. But within that suppressed anger may lie the key to courage, the fire to speak truth, to defend what matters, to claim space. By facing the anger, they do not become violent, they become whole. Or take the individual who disowns their sensuality due to cultural conditioning. Their life becomes sterile, emotionally distant. But in reclaiming their sensual nature, they rediscover joy, presence, and aliveness. The shadow does not corrupt them, it completes them. But this process is not easy. It requires shadow work, the ongoing commitment to observe, reflect, and integrate the parts of ourselves we have buried. This is not a one-time event. It is a practice, a discipline of truth. Shadow work involves watching our emotional triggers and asking, what does this say about me? Listening to our dreams, which often reveal the shadow in symbolic form. Writing, meditating, or speaking with radical honesty about our darker impulses. Creating safe spaces, such as therapy or ritual, to explore what we fear in ourselves. And perhaps most importantly, responding to these discoveries with compassion, not judgment, because shame is what built the mask. Only grace can take it off. This is why shadow work is sacred. It is not a self-help trend. It is an initiation, a descent into the underworld of the psyche, not to be consumed by it, but to retrieve what was lost, to bring light into darkness and darkness into light, to become not perfect, but real. As Jung wrote, there is no light without shadow, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. And this imperfection, once feared, becomes the soil for empathy, humility, and depth. For when we know our own shadow, we no longer fear it in others. We no longer need to punish, or project, or pretend. We can meet people not as masks, but as mirrors, not as enemies, but as reflections of the same shared struggle. This is how healing begins, not just within, but between. Because when we stop running from the shadow, we stop waging war with ourselves. And when we stop waging war with ourselves, the world begins to follow. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung, we have traveled through the mask, into the shadow, and through the collective darkness that haunts our shared human story. But where do we go from here? The modern psyche, addicted to goals and solutions, asks, what is the final step? How do we fix this? But the truth is, integration is not a step. It is a path, a lifelong unfolding, not toward perfection, but toward wholeness. Wholeness means no part is left behind. Not the sadness we buried as children. Not the anger we were told to fear. Not the jealousy, the grief, the fear, the longing. Not even the darkness. To be whole is to be in relationship with all that we are, the noble and the flawed, the sacred and the broken, the known and the mysterious. It is to stand in the middle of our contradictions and not flinch. But we live in a culture that worships clarity, simplicity, and success. It trains us to seek final answers, ultimate identities, and neat narratives. Yet the soul does not speak in straight lines. It speaks in paradox, in dreams, in symbol, in silence. And so, the path forward is not upward, it is inward. We begin by noticing when we are performing. When we speak from fear instead of truth. When we default to the persona instead of choosing presence. We learn to pause, to ask, what am I hiding right now? To listen, even when we would rather defend, to stay, even when we want to run. And slowly, the inner self begins to reveal itself, not all at once, not without resistance, but in glimpses, in moments of clarity, in unexpected tenderness, in the quiet courage to be honest. This process is not always graceful. In fact, it often looks like falling apart. Why? Because dismantling the persona, even partially, can feel like a death. The ego, used to control, panics. The shadow, newly visible, feels overwhelming. Relationships may shift. Careers may shake. Our sense of self may unravel. But this is not collapse. It is composting. The false self is decaying to nourish something deeper, something more resilient, something true. In Jungian psychology, this is the process of individuation, the sacred journey of aligning the ego with the self, the deeper totality of our being. It is not about becoming better. It is about becoming real. It is not about eliminating contradiction. It is about embracing it with wisdom. And here's the paradox. The more we embrace our brokenness, the less broken we feel. Because suffering becomes sacred when it is integrated. This doesn't mean we glorify pain. It means we stop running from it. We let it teach us, and pain, when welcomed, becomes portal, not prison. In this process, humility is everything, because we will make mistakes, we will stumble, we will wear the mask again, we will project, we will avoid, we will forget. That's not failure, that's the work. Each moment of forgetting is an opportunity to remember, to breathe, to soften, to return. And with each return, the soul expands. Not because we've become someone new, but because we've reclaimed who we've always been. This reclamation ripples outward. When one person does their shadow work, the field around them shifts. Their relationships become more honest. Their community becomes more courageous. Their presence becomes a kind of quiet medicine. This is why the work matters, not just for us, but for the world. Because a society built on personas will collapse under its own falseness. But a society built on authenticity, on inner integration, on emotional maturity that society can evolve. And it begins with the individual. It begins with you, with me, with anyone willing to stop performing and start becoming. To become what? Not a finished product, not a spiritual ideal, but a whole human being capable of joy and grief, tenderness and strength, clarity and confusion, capable of holding their own light and their own shadow without shame. Because once we make peace with what's inside us, the world outside becomes less frightening. We no longer need enemies. We no longer need masks. We no longer need to conquer others to feel safe. And in this space of peace, something ancient awakens, the part of us that remembers we are not separate, that what we do to others, we do to ourselves, that healing is not escape, it is embodiment. And so, the invitation is not to transcend the self, but to inhabit it fully, to walk this world as someone who has met their own soul in the dark, who has sat with shame and chosen compassion, who has witnessed rage and chosen presence, who has walked through illusion and chosen truth. This is the quiet revolution, the unseen transformation, the turning of light inward until it shines through every crack we tried to seal. As Leonard Cohen once wrote, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And perhaps it's also how the soul gets out. You are not your mask. You are not your image. You are not your curated persona, nor the shadow that hides behind it. You are the one who watches, the one who chooses, the one who dares to become whole, even if it costs you everything false. So let the masks fall. Let the shadows speak. Let the self rise. Not perfect, but free.